Hello class, this is Case Study 5 Part 2 in our exploration of strategies for climate change. In this lecture, we're going to learn some basic climate science as well as understand our impacts on our planet and the results of our impacts and ways that we can change. Today we're going to talk about what we can do about it, and then as part of an online research project, you are going to present some of your ideas about this. So the title of our lecture is Fight or Flight. And so what we could really say is, how can we mitigate or adapt to climate change? Now, mitigation would have us ask, what can be done to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions? The overall answer is that we need to decrease our sources of greenhouse gases and increase our sinks, which are those places that can absorb these greenhouse gases. Adaptation is another strategy. Humans can adapt to reduce our vulnerability to climate change. For example, we need to promote shore protection techniques that does not destroy all the habitat but still protects our oceanfront communities. We also need to find ways to control insect outbreaks so that disease does not spread as climate change continues to escalate. Climate change involves economic issues. There's really no easy answer, and it costs a lot of money. That's basically why we have not been very proactive with fighting climate change, particularly in the United States, because those corporate interests have so much money wrapped up into the current system that we simply have not made the necessary changes. However, if we do not have a radical rethinking of electricity production and distribution in California, it could even be more costly in the long run. Over 2.5 trillion in real estate assets are at risk in California due to climate change and its impacts in the decades to come. So what are some of the economic and political approaches to climate change? Well, one is to create a market for carbon, and this is often done through carbon offsets or cap and trade. Carbon offsetting enables you to take responsibility for the carbon emissions your activities create by paying someone to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on your behalf. On the other hand, cap and trade is where the government sets up an overall cap and sources are given allowances in which they are able to emit gases up to the cap. Sources can buy or sell allowances or bank them for future years. Cap and trade often encourages innovation in technological advances. Another approach is to support low-carbon technology, which includes but is not limited to both efficiency and renewables. Finally, it might be important to create incentives, and this largely comes down to government organizations around the world. It can involve tax breaks and rebates, or loans or reparations to developing countries that are impacted by climate change. There are also environmental approaches to climate change. First off, how can we adapt? Well, farmers can plant different crops for changing seasons. By shifting agriculture, we might be able to adapt to our changing planet. However, populations will need to be displaced. For example, millions of people will need to move farther away from the coast, since the coastlines will ultimately be impacted as sea levels rise. Mitigation and adaptation can go hand in hand. For one, we can mitigate by learning to live with a lighter footprint. By cultivating eco-awareness and supporting movements that reduce our carbon footprints, this will ultimately lead to a healthier planet. Technological development is a part of this solution as well. By changing technologies, we might be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change at the same time. One example is geoengineering, which is a type of climate engineering. It is a deliberate, large-scale engineering and manipulation of our planetary environment to combat or counteract anthropogenic changes in atmospheric chemistry. Sequestration can also be a possible answer. This is the artificial capture of carbon dioxide into sinks, which are typically huge underground aquifers or tanks. There are many different institutes and organizations trying to come up with real solutions, but I want to highlight one of them from Princeton University. They came up with a system that is called the Carbon Mitigation Initiative. And this presentation is based on what is called stabilization wedges. Stabilization wedges is a concept that was first presented many years ago, and it continues to be a possible solution for places like the United States that need to grapple with changing our technologies over the next 50 years. So on this graph, it shows us the last 50 years and how our historical emissions have been going up and up and up. We've been climbing for the last 50 years, which is not a good thing. Moving forward in the next 50 years, we need to have a flat path in which we stop adding so much carbon emissions to our atmosphere, and then after that, implement technologies that can help us ultimately start to decrease our carbon emissions. So these wedges are these different techniques that can be used to try to alleviate this current path that is going up and up and up like a ramp. So if we place these 7 wedges into place, it will allow us to reach our goal, which is in 50 years have the same global emissions as today. Because if we continue to increase at the same rate as we have for the 50 years, it could be potentially catastrophic for all life on our planet. So for those 7 wedges, the Princeton think tank came up with 15 different strategies in 4 categories. And these stabilization strategies include things around fuel switching, carbon capture and storage, renewables, forest and soil storage, energy efficiency, conservation, and even nuclear energy was considered. One of the end results of implementing these new technologies is to decrease our carbon dioxide emissions and our carbon dioxide concentration to 350 parts per million or less. We're currently going well above that, but we need to get back down to this range in order to ensure the health of our planet. Climate change involves environmental justice. Remember, environmental justice is the fight against inequitable distributions of environmental burdens. Many people around the world are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change, and because they have no access to money or other resources, they have no choice but to bear the brunt. And that is simply not fair, that the rich that are ultimately creating these problems can then flee climate change and have very few effects. Just some of the problems that are facing the poorer nations, as well as communities in the United States that do not have as much access to resource, includes problems with illness due to pollution, inferior transportation options and housing, less access to parks and other public spaces, and a degraded natural environment that ultimately leads to less farmlands, hunger, and poverty. So lots of things need to be taken into consideration when we are combating global climate change. Well, I hope that this was a good orientation for you, both to environmental science and climate change. And you're going to really explore this further in your research projects, where we're going to talk about climate change and figure out what we can do. Thank you very much for listening, and email me with any questions.